Ladies and gentlemen, one of the greatest sources of human suffering is the desperate need to understand everything before taking the next step. People want guarantees. They want visible proof. They want certainty before obedience. And because of that, many spend years trapped in hesitation, mentally exhausted from trying to solve problems that were never meant to be solved through human reasoning alone. They keep asking, how is this going to work? How will I recover? How will the door open? How will things change? And while those questions seem logical, they often become the very chains that keep a person spiritually paralyzed. What most people do not realize is that the mind was never designed to carry the weight of complete control. The human mind can analyze, prepare, and plan, but it cannot peacefully sustain the burden of trying to predict every outcome. The moment a person becomes obsessed with controlling the future, anxiety quietly takes over. Fear begins disguising itself as responsibility. Overthinking disguises itself as wisdom. And eventually a person becomes emotionally drained, not because life is impossible, but because they are trying to manage realities that belong in God's hands. This is why some people feel exhausted even when nothing physically demanding has happened. Their bodies are present in one moment, but their minds are living in 10 different imaginary futures at the same time. They are fighting conversations that have not happened yet. They are grieving outcomes that do not even exist. They are carrying tomorrow's problems before tomorrow has even arrived. And slowly, this constant mental striving disconnects them from peace. But Scripture repeatedly reveals a truth that human pride struggles to accept. God does not require full understanding before obedience. In fact, throughout history, God often moved most powerfully when people could not fully see the outcome. Noah built before rain appeared. Abraham walked without knowing the destination. Moses stood before a sea with no visible solution. Again and again, the pattern remains the same. God rarely provides the entire blueprint in advance because complete visibility would remove the necessity of trust. And this is where many people struggle. They say they trust God, but emotionally, they trust explanations more than they trust Him. They feel secure only when circumstance makes sense. But faith was never designed to depend on visible evidence. Faith is the decision to believe that God is already working, even when the human eye cannot yet detect movement. Psychologically, this becomes difficult because the human brain craves certainty. It wants closure. It wants control because control creates the illusion of safety. But spiritually, some of the greatest transformations happen when certainty disappears. Because when a person finally reaches the limit of their own understanding, they become open to dependence on something greater than themselves. There is a reason God often allows seasons where answers feel delayed. Those seasons expose what we are truly depending on. Some people discover that their peace was never rooted in God at all. It was rooted in predictability. As long as life followed their preferred timeline, they felt stable. But the moment uncertainty arrived, fear took over. Why? Because uncertainty reveals the foundation beneath the soul. And yet, even in those moments of confusion, God is never inactive. This is the part people fail to see. While they are panicking over what is visible, God is already arranging what is invisible. He is moving through conversations they know nothing about. He is closing doors that would have destroyed them later. He is delaying certain outcomes because premature blessings can become burdens. He is preparing strength before responsibility, wisdom before opportunity, character before elevation. But when people become obsessed with how, they lose the ability to recognize this deeper work. Their minds become consumed with methods instead of trust. They stare at limitations instead of possibilities. They measure divine power through human logic. And this is why worry becomes spiritually dangerous. Worry narrows perception. It convinces people that if they cannot personally see the solution, no solution exists. Yet some of the greatest breakthroughs in life begin in complete invisibility. A seed beneath the ground looks lifeless before it becomes a tree. A child in the womb develops in hiddenness before birth. Even transformation within the human soul often happens silently long before external evidence appears. God has always done some of His deepest work in places human eyes cannot monitor. That means your current confusion is not proof that God has abandoned you. Urina. By Liddy, to see the path does not mean the path is absent. It simply means you are being asked to trust beyond the limits of your own understanding. And perhaps that is the real battle, not the problem itself, but the fear of releasing control. Because the moment a person finally stops demanding to know every detail, peace begins to return. Not because every answer has appeared, but because trust has replaced obsession. And sometimes the first miracle God performs is not changing your situation immediately. It is freeing you from the belief that you must carry the entire future by yourself. One of the hardest experiences in life is waiting while nothing appears to be changing. Human nature instinctively looks for visible movement. We feel reassured when doors open quickly, when prayers are answered immediately, when circumstances shift in ways we can measure and explain. But some of God's most important work happens in silence, and silence has a way of testing the human heart like almost nothing else. Most people interpret silence emotionally rather than spiritually. When they do not see progress, they assume failure. When answers delay, they assume abandonment. When life becomes uncertain, they conclude that God is absent. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you cannot detect movement does not mean movement is not taking place. In fact, some of the greatest turning points in life are developing long before they become visible. Think about how much of existence operates invisibly. The human mind itself is invisible, yet it shapes entire lives. Roots grow beneath the surface before a tree ever appears above ground. Even the formation of character happens privately before it becomes publicly recognizable. We accept invisible processes in nearly every area of life except the spiritual one. There, we become impatient. We demand immediate proof. We want visible confirmation that God is working before we are willing to rest. But God has never limited himself to what human eyes can measure. This is why many people misjudge their own season. They look at delays and assume defeat, when in reality God may be protecting them from outcomes they are not prepared to carry yet. A blessing received too early can become a burden instead of a breakthrough. Opportunity without wisdom destroys people. Influence without maturity corrupts people. Relationship entered at the wrong time create pain instead of peace. And because human beings often judge by emotion rather than timing, they frequently crave things that would harm them if received prematurely. That is why divine timing can feel uncomfortable. It does not always align with human urgency. We want immediate relief, but God is often more concerned with long-term transformation than temporary comfort. We ask him to remove pressure, while he uses pressure to strengthen what weakness could never develop. We ask for open doors, while he first develops the character necessary to walk through those doors responsibly. And this is where trust becomes deeply difficult. Because the human mind naturally assumes that if nothing is happening externally, nothing is happening at all. Yet throughout Scripture, God repeatedly worked behind the scenes long before people recognized his hand. Joseph was betrayed, forgotten, and imprisoned before he ever reached the position God had prepared for him. David was anointed king long before he ever sat on a throne. There were years of obscurity between the promise and the fulfillment. And during those hidden years, it would have been idiotic to assume that God had forgotten them. But what looked like delay was actually preparation. This principle still governs life today. There are conversations taking place that you know nothing about. There are opportunities being formed beyond your awareness. There are closed doors you may one day thank God for. There are disappointments that protected you from paths that would have drained your peace, destroyed your focus, or delayed your purpose. But in the moment, human emotion cannot always see that clearly. Psychologically, this is one of the greatest struggles of the human condition. People crave certainty because certainty feels safe. The unknown creates discomfort because it removes the illusion of control. And yet growth almost always requires entering seasons where certainty disappears. The irony is that many people pray for transformation while resisting the uncertainty transformation requires. No person becomes stronger without tension. No soul deepens without waiting. No mature faith develops without moments where trust must survive silence. And perhaps that is why God allows these seasons. Not to punish people, but to expose what truly governs them internally. Because silence reveals whether a person's faith depends on visible results or on the character of God himself. Anyone can feel confident when prayers are answered instantly. But real spiritual depth develops when a person continues trusting even when heaven seems quiet. That kind of faith changes the structure of the soul. It breaks dependence on circumstances. It loosens the addiction to immediate gratification. It teaches patience, endurance, and emotional stability in ways comfort never could. The truth is, God often works in hiddenness because hiddenness protects the process. Not everything can develop publicly. Some things require privacy before they can survive visibility. Even nature understands this principle. Seeds remain underground before growth appears above the surface. And just because nothing is visible above the ground does not mean life is absent below it. The same may be true in your life right now. You may feel delayed, but delay is not denial. You may feel forgotten, but hidden seasons are often preparation seasons. You may feel uncertain, but uncertainty does not mean God has lost control. Sometimes God is doing His deepest work precisely in the places where our human eyes see nothing at all. And one day, what felt like silence will reveal itself as strategy. What felt like delay will reveal itself as protection. And what felt like abandonment will reveal itself as the moment God was preparing a future greater than anything you could have arranged on your own. Because God's greatest answers are often being built long before they arrive. Worry has a way of disguising itself as responsibility. People often convince themselves that constant mental pressure means they are being careful, prepared, or wise. But there is a profound difference between thoughtful concern and destructive worry. Concern leads a person toward action, clarity, and wisdom. Worry traps a person in cycles of fear that produce no solution at all. It consumes emotional energy without creating meaningful change. And over time, it slowly reshapes the mind, the body, and even the spirit. What makes worry so dangerous is that it pulls a person out of the present moment and forces them into imagined futures that do not yet exist. The body may be sitting in one room, but the mind is already living through tomorrow's disasters. It imagines conversations that have not happened. It predicts rejection before anyone has spoken. It rehearses failure before any opportunity arrives. And because the human nervous system often responds to imagined threats as though they are real, the person begins suffering emotionally and physically from events that may never happen at all. This is why chronic worry exhausts people so deeply. The mind was not designed to carry endless uncertainty without rest. When fear becomes constant, the body eventually reflects it. Sleep becomes difficult. Peace disappears. Emotional reactions intensify. Small problems begin feeling overwhelming because the soul is already overloaded. Many people are not collapsing under the weight of their actual circumstances. They are collapsing under the weight of imagined futures they keep replaying in their minds. And the tragedy is that worry creates the illusion of control while actually removing control. People believe that if they think long enough, analyze deeply enough, or anticipate every possible problem, they can somehow protect themselves from pain. But life has never worked that way. Human beings cannot think themselves into complete security. There will always be unknowns. There will always be uncertainty. There will always be moments where outcomes remain beyond personal control. This is where the spiritual battle truly begins, because worry is ultimately rooted in a deeper question. Who or what do you trust most? When fear dominates the mind, it reveals where attention has settled. The mind naturally magnifies whatever it stares at repeatedly. If a person continually focuses on uncertainty, uncertainty grows larger emotionally. If they focus constantly on potential loss, fear intensifies. But if attention begins shifting toward the character of God rather than the unpredictability of circumstances, something internally begins to stabilize. This does not mean pretending difficulties are unreal. Faith is not denial. Faith does not ignore pain, loss, or uncertainty. Rather, faith places those realities into a larger perspective. It recognizes that human understanding is limited while God's vision is complete. And that realization changes the emotional posture of a person's life. One of the reasons Jesus spoke so directly about worry is because he understood how destructive it becomes to the human soul. Worry narrows perception. It shrinks hope. It drains joy from the present moment. A worried mind cannot fully experience peace because it is always preparing for catastrophe. And eventually, the person becomes emotionally addicted to fear without even realizing it. They no longer know how to rest internally because anxiety has become their normal state of existence. Psychologically, this creates a dangerous cycle. The more people worry, the more they feel the need to keep worrying. because worry falsely convinces them they are staying prepared. But in reality, worry rarely prepares anyone for pain. It simply causes them to suffer twice, once in imagination and again in reality if the difficulty actually comes. And yet so much of life remains outside human control, no matter how much a person worries. No amount of anxiety can force tomorrow to arrive safely. No amount of fear can guarantee outcomes. No amount of overthinking can create certainty about the future. Worry promises protection but delivers exhaustion. This is why peace cannot come from perfect circumstances. If peace depends entirely on external stability, then peace will constantly disappear because life itself is unpredictable. Real peace must come from something deeper than circumstances. It must come from trust. And trust is difficult because it requires surrendering the illusion of control. Human pride resists this. The ego wants mastery over every outcome. It wants explanations for everything. It wants guarantees before obedience. But eventually every person reaches moments where no human strategy can fully remove uncertainty. At that point, the soul must choose between two paths: endless anxiety or surrender. That surrender does not mean becoming passive or irresponsible. It means recognizing the limits of human control and refusing to let fear dominate the mind. It means doing what wisdom requires while releasing what only God can carry. It means learning to live in the present instead of mentally collapsing under futures that have not arrived. And perhaps this is why some people never experience peace even when life improves externally. Because peace was never meant to come from control. It comes from trust in the one who sees what human eyes cannot see. The future may still contain uncertainty. Questions may remain unanswered. Circumstances may not immediately change. But when trust replaces fear, the soul no longer lives as a prisoner of imagined outcomes. Because the greatest freedom is not knowing every detail about tomorrow, it is knowing that God is already there before you arrive. There comes a moment in nearly every person's life when effort alone no longer works. They have analyzed the situation repeatedly, tried to force outcomes, pushed every door they could find, and exhausted themselves attempting to control what happens next. And yet, despite all their striving, peace still feels distant. The mind remains restless. The heart remains heavy. The future still feels uncertain. It is often in that moment when human strength finally reaches its limit that a deeper spiritual truth begins to emerge. Sometimes the breakthrough is not waiting on more effort. Sometimes it is waiting on surrender. That word makes many people uncomfortable because surrender is often misunderstood. Human culture tends to associate surrender with weakness, defeat, or passivity. People believe that if they let go, everything will fall apart. So they continue gripping situations tightly, believing control will protect them from pain. But psychologically and spiritually, excessive control often becomes the very source of suffering. A person cannot experience deep peace while trying to control every possible outcome. The human nervous system was never designed to carry that burden continuously. Eventually, the soul becomes exhausted from resisting uncertainty. And this is why surrender is not weakness at all. Surrender is the recognition that there are limits to human control and that peace begins when those limits are finally acknowledged. Many people delay their own healing because they refuse to release what God is trying to remove. They hold on to relationships that continuously drain them because they fear loneliness more than dysfunction. They force timelines that are rooted in impatience rather than wisdom. They chase doors God quietly closed because their identity became attached to a specific outcome. And in doing so, they create internal conflict between their will and God's direction. But God will never force alignment. He invites it. This is one of the deepest spiritual principles people struggle to accept. God often allows frustration to continue until a person becomes willing to release control. Not because he enjoys watching them struggle, but because transformation cannot happen while a person clings desperately to fear, pride, or self-dependence. Some lessons cannot be understood intellectually alone. They must be experienced through surrender. And surrender requires humility because it forces a person to admit that their perspective is incomplete. Human beings naturally see only fragments of reality. We interpret life through emotion, memory, fear, and limited understanding. But God sees consequences before they unfold. He sees hidden dangers behind attractive opportunities. He sees timing in ways the human mind cannot fully comprehend. That means some closed doors are acts of protection, not punishment. Some delays are acts of mercy. Some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. But none of that becomes clear while a person is fighting desperately to preserve control over every detail of life. There is also a psychological freedom that comes through surrender. The moment people stop trying to force outcomes beyond their control, emotional pressure begins to loosen. They stop carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. They stop measuring their worth through external success or immediate answers. They stop believing every unanswered question. I say yes. And strangely enough, clarity often arrives after surrender, not before it. This is because fear creates noise within the mind. Anxiety distorts perception. Desperation clouds judgment. But surrender quiets the internal chaos enough for wisdom to emerge. A person who is no longer consumed by panic can finally recognize direction more clearly. That does not mean life instantly becomes easy. Faith does not remove every challenge. But surrender changes the posture of the soul. Instead of fighting constantly against uncertainty, the person begins walking with trust. Instead of demanding complete explanations, they become willing to move forward one step at a time. And in that posture, they often discover that God had already been making a way long before they recognized it. The opportunity appears unexpectedly. The healing begins gradually. The right relationship enters naturally. The strength they thought they lacked suddenly becomes available when they need it most. Not because they controlled every detail perfectly, but because they finally stopped resisting God's process. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside every season of uncertainty. God does not ask people to carry the future alone. He asks them to trust Him enough to release what they were never meant to control. Because sometimes the door opens only after the striving stops. Sometimes the answer appears only after the fear is surrendered. And sometimes the miracle begins the moment a person finally lets God lead.